Part 4, here we go. Give this video a like if you watched all of my last video, but more importantly, give yourself a like. Epistle, it's a poem by Lee Young Lee. How is imagery used in this poem to explore the concept of wisdom? I'm going to move as quickly as I can to develop a thesis statement. Supporting point number 1 with a couple of quotations. Supporting point number 2 with a couple of quotations. Supporting point number 3, which is really optional depending on what I need to do in order to prove my thesis. And then a concluding statement, which is kind of like the ultimate takeaway from the poem as I answer this question. So that final takeaway and my thesis statement are really going to be something about what does this poem offer the reader ultimately when it comes to an understanding of wisdom. Before I can do that, I have to read the poem initially and develop like a baseline understanding of how the poem works before I can start to answer those questions. Epistle. Of wisdom, splendid columns of light waking sweet foreheads, I know nothing. But what I've glimpsed in my most hopeful daydreams of a world without end, amen, I know nothing. But what I sang of once with others, all of us standing in the vaulted room. But there is wisdom in the hour in which a boy sits in his room listening to the sound of weeping coming from some other room of his father's house. And that boy was me, and he listened without understanding and was soon frightened by how the monotonous sobs resembled laughter. All of this while noon became vast day, while sunlight and the clock gave birth to melancholy before the days grew vacant. The sun grew terrible, the clock stopped, and melancholy gave up to grief. All of this in a dead hour of a dead day, among doors closed for a nap or prayer. Who was weeping? Why? Did the boy fall asleep? Did he flee that house? Is he there now? Before it all gets wiped away, let me say, there is wisdom in the slender hour which arrives between two shadows. It is not heavenly, and it is not sweet. It is accompanied by steady human weeping and twin furrows between the brows, but it is what I know, and so am able to tell. So how is this thing working? One thing that I look at first in a poem is structure. How is it structured? Where are sentences, where are lines, and where are stanzas? As I'm doing this, I'm still thinking about imagery. Of wisdom, splendid columns of light, waking sweet foreheads. That's an image right there. Splendid columns of light, waking sweet foreheads is, what does that image do? What does it evoke? What does it do emotionally on the reader? I would imagine that this is like definitely going to be a piece of evidence that I'm going to use in my analysis because it's the first image. But the first image is fit in a sequence of images: vaulted room, standing in the vaulted room, glimpsed in my most hopeful daydreams. That's really like, this is part 1. Part 1. And what do these images evoke? What are they related to? To my understanding, almost like organized religion of a world without end, concepts like eternity. And they're also quite, the images that we have here, the vaulted room, sang once with others, is like a reference, I feel like, to church, to a church experience. And so initially, he's telling us that he knows nothing about this version of wisdom. We have here, so now we have enjambment, enjammed, 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 comma, enjammed, enjammed. There's no internal punctuation. Our next one is right here. So we really have some balance. 3 three-line stanzas, 3 three-line stanzas, each one of them punctuated as one sentence that offers, to my opinion, like a contrast between different understandings of what wisdom could be understood as. But there is wisdom in the hour in which a boy sits in his room listening. So this is much more intimate. These are big. This is with others. This is alone. So there's a contrast. The sound of weeping contrasted to the sound of singing. So these are my thoughts as I'm moving forward. I have not developed a thesis statement. I don't know what my supporting points are, but my first one might be a compare and contrast. So by contrasting these two understandings of what wisdom is, that's like his opening move as a poem and as a poet. And then we have a change in structure. We have 2 stanzas. There's a sentence. And this, to me, seems to be about time, sunlight and the clock, and noon and a day, days growing vacant. Days grew vacant, the sun grew terrible, the clock stopped, and melancholy gave up to grief. If you're taking your exam and you're doing this is all happening in your head, you're not talking out loud. All of this in a dead hour of a dead day among doors closed for nap or prayer. So here we have 1. Here we have 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sentences in one stanza. Now we're back to 1, 2. My thesis statement is going to start with like this idea of, if you contrast like this idea of wisdom, which might be like a religious concept of wisdom, with something that's much more intimate and less certain and more painful. He presents an intimate, personal examination, or I would say probably understanding of wisdom. And that would be like my first sentence. So my first sentence, it's not my complete understanding. I'm going to save that for my last sentence. This is a way to understand it where your introduction is actually like, this is going to be in my introductory paragraph. This is going to be my introductory paragraph. This is going to be my introductory paragraph. And then this is going to be the last sentence of my introductory paragraph, which is going to be something that's more nuanced than this. It's intimate, it's personal, but like that doesn't have the depth that I think I want to have for a high scoring. So I have to go beyond that and talk about what? Where is the ultimate conclusion? It's this, it is not heavenly and it is not sweet. It is accompanied by steady human weeping. So I have intimate personal understanding. This concluding statement would be something links wisdom to suffering. How am I going to prove that? Well, twin furrows between the brows is like very clearly, that's evidence that what he's really talking about is suffering, and that's very much an image. So my exam paper becomes like me translating or deriving meaning from the particular images that are used. Steady human weeping. So what are my supporting points? Well, I talked about the compare-contrast aspect of things. Li Young Lee effectively accomplishes this. I'll say contrasting religious understandings with more personal experiences. So what is the very special and unique approach that this poem has to the concept of wisdom? Process of discovery. I might add that to the thesis statement. My next step after I say like, okay, I think this is going on, is what's my evidence? What am I actually going to discuss? Each of these, they're just like, in my paragraph, what am I going to do? Well, one thing that I might do is I might talk about that structure that I uncovered, and like we've got three line stanzas and three line stanzas here, and very clearly through the punctuation, they're structured as like one image. That might be the first thing that I talk about, structure, which is really like sentence at the sentence level and the stanza level. That's not directly related to imagery, but that is how I'm able to understand the contrast between these images. So it seems like it's a worthy thing to do. I'm moving quickly. Splendid columns of light waking sweet foreheads. And like for IB, they really love like a 3-word quotation. And as soon as you get to like a 6-word quotation, they're like a little like, what are you doing? There's so many words here. So splendid columns of light, waking sweet foreheads so powerfully evokes like innocence. So now you can see how like I'm thinking more, I'm getting more depth. And maybe this becomes 2 paragraphs. Waking sweet foreheads, I could probably combine those into one point that's about splendid columns of light, waking sweet foreheads really evokes connotations of innocence, connotations of the image of like the light streaming through the clouds. That's kind of like the classic background for like a Christian religious quotation from the Bible or something like that. There was one hanging in my grandmother's house. I remember it very, very well. I'm going to link these together as like number one right here.
One right there.
Or without end, if I needed to. That's another clear, very clear reference to religion or concepts of eternity or things like that. Standing in a vaulted room, I think that is probably another thing that fits in. Standing in the vaulted room, with an emphasis on the vaulted room. It wasn't just a vaulted room, it was the vaulted room. That's the kind of thing, that's a very specific choice in diction that I might draw attention to. So that's 2 right here. And then if I were going to contrast that, so here he's singing, here he's listening. I think that's a powerful contrast. Singing versus listening. So wisdom is not singing. Wisdom is not, look at me, I am producing wisdom. Wisdom is taken in through listening and through experience. So in his room listening to the sound of weeping, and it's not in a church, it's in his own house. So this might be 3, and this might be some other room in his father's house. The sound of weeping. So you could also say that we have some visual imagery, and now we have some auditory imagery. The boy was me. And so this is where like this personal experience. So maybe that's my second point, would be that we have contrasting imagery. Let me get this right here. So this is, one is like religion. This is singing. The third one is, importantly, listening. And maybe I would have another point from here, but you get kind of like how this is working. Singing, this is listening, this is religion, to my mind. There's one thing that I neglected to mention you that I should probably mention in this title. If you read this title, epistle, and you don't know what that is, this is the type of word that would be defined for you on the exam. And in this case, that definition might work its way into the analysis I was just talking about. An epistle is a letter, or it is also a book from the Christian Bible that's in the form of a letter, the letters of Paul, which are part of the Christian Bible. So what do we have so far? We've got support number 1, contrasting religious understandings of wisdom with lived experience, I think is important. And when we move to that part 2, this might be our key into what that second point is going to be, which might be like highly personal. So let's see, how does that fit in with our thesis statement? Young Lee creates an intimate personal understanding of wisdom in his poem, Epistle. The poem charts the journey of discovery the speaker engages on by successfully contrasting the imagery in the poem works effectively to contrast religious understandings with more personal experiences. So what's maybe something about that personal nature. So support number 1, support number 2 might be something like, now that I've highlighted this turn that the poem takes from singing to listening, there might be one other piece of evidence that I would put into that particular paragraph, this big paragraph that contrasts religious understanding with more personal experience, would be monotonous sobs resembled laughter. I think that is a key line for understanding. There's, it's very tender, this poem. It's very sensitive and careful and emotional. So there's a tenderness. That might be links wisdom to suffering with a high degree of maybe like self-acceptance / tenderness. That might be the ultimate conclusion that I arrive at. And how do I get there? This monotonous sobs resemble laughter. So if I were going to look for evidence, like let's say that, because this is kind of like my conclusion that I finally arrive at, but this second point And so I see, my intro paragraph is going to be 75 to 100 words. And then this paragraph right here with this much evidence, I'm thinking is going to be probably 350 words. So what do I need? I need really one more paragraph, and then I need that conclusion that ties everything together. What is my other paragraph going to examine? This might be something like more personal with self-acceptance and tenderness. So where's that self-acceptance and tenderness? Also saying wisdom links to suffering, and it's fleeting and difficult to define. Wisdom, I would say that's also that's also like a key part of this poem. Links to wisdom is suffering, slender, difficult to define, more personal with self-acceptance and tenderness. The boy was me, dead hour of the dead day. Intimate, personal, trust the journey of discovery, by contrasting religious with more personal experiences. In the examination of those personal experiences, it is approached, the images, ultimately defining it, slender, personal. I would start writing it now at this point with this. Even with this point not fully understood, I would start writing it at this point. More discovery will occur as these paragraphs come into being